December 23rd, 1944. 6 Japanese POWs received an invitation that their military code said was impossible. Enemy farmers asking them to share Christmas dinner with their families, completely unguarded. These soldiers expected execution at every moment of captivity, so when they saw what was actually on that dinner table and how they were treated, would this forbidden kindness destroy them or transform them? The war in the Pacific was at its worst. Across Australia, 27 prison camps held more than 14,000 Japanese soldiers. These men sat behind barbed wire fences waiting. Most of them believed they would die here. Their training had been clear. Capture was the ultimate shame. Death was better than surrender. Every Japanese soldier knew this from the first day of basic training. The emperor himself had said it. A true warrior never allows himself to be taken alive. In rural New South Wales, the landscape stretched flat and brown under the summer sun. This was farm country. Wheat fields ran for miles. Sheep grazed on dry grass. Small towns dotted the dirt roads, places with names like Cowra and Hay. The Cowra camp alone held 2,223 Japanese prisoners. Another 545 Italian soldiers lived in a separate section. Tall fences surrounded everything. Guard towers stood at each corner. Australian soldiers walked the perimeter with rifles on their shoulders. But something strange was happening in this war, something the Japanese prisoners did not expect. They were not being executed. Every morning they woke up alive. 3 times each day, guards brought food: rice, bread, vegetables, sometimes meat. The prisoners counted the calories. 1,800 per day. Some of them whispered that this was more food than Australian civilians were getting, more than their own families back home were eating. How could this be? They were the enemy. They were supposed to suffer. The prisoners had been told stories before they shipped out to fight, stories about how the Allies treated captives, torture, they said, starvation, brutal beatings. The Americans and Australians were demons in human skin. They would cut off fingers. They would burn prisoners alive. Every Japanese soldier carried these images in his mind. When they were finally captured, weak from hunger or wounded from battle, they closed their eyes and waited for the pain to begin. Instead, medics treated their wounds. The same doctors who cared for Australian soldiers stitched up Japanese injuries. They used the same clean bandages, the same medicines. Guards handed out blankets at night. The rifles stayed on shoulders. Violence was rare. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. The prisoners began to understand that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this. By late 1944, Australia faced a serious problem. 80% of farm workers had enlisted to fight. The wheat needed harvesting. The sheep needed shearing. The vegetables needed picking. Without help, crops would rot in the fields. The government made a decision. Prisoners of war would work on farms. Small groups would leave the main camps each morning. They would ride in trucks to properties in the countryside. Australian soldiers would supervise, but the work was real. The need was desperate. At first, the prisoners could not believe what they saw. The farms had machines, actual mechanical harvesters that could do the work of 40 men, trucks with engines that ran on petrol, refrigerated buildings that kept meat fresh for weeks. One prisoner stared at a single harvester and thought about his village back home. His entire prefecture did not have this much machinery. Everyone there used hand tools, sickles, and hoes. Their backs bent over rice paddies from dawn until dark. The contrast grew sharper every day. During lunch breaks, farmers brought out cold drinks. Coca-Cola in glass bottles, still cool from the icebox. Prisoners held the bottles in their hands, confused. This was a luxury they had never imagined. Some had never tasted carbonated water before. The sweetness made them blink. On Sundays, after the morning work was done, a farmer's wife sometimes brought out ice cream. Vanilla, chocolate, flavors most of the prisoners could not name. They ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to understand how the enemy had so much when Japan had so little. The guards were not cruel. This was perhaps the strangest thing of all. They carried rifles, yes, but they also told jokes. They offered cigarettes during breaks. They learned a few Japanese words. The prisoners, carefully, cautiously, began teaching them. Please, thank you. Good morning. In exchange, they learned English, water, food, rest. Small bridges built between enemies, one word at a time. Inside the prisoners' barracks at night, whispered conversations began. Men who had fought in New Guinea shared their memories. Near the end, they had been eating tree bark, boiling leather boots to make soup, 800 calories a day if they were lucky. Comrades had died from starvation more often than bullets, and now here they were, enemies in captivity, eating more than they had as free soldiers. The mathematics did not make sense. The propaganda did not match reality. November arrived. Summer in Australia heading toward the hottest months. A farm foreman mentioned something to the working prisoners one afternoon. Christmas was coming, he said. You will join us for dinner in December. He said it casually, like it was obvious, like it was normal to invite enemy soldiers to a family meal. The prisoners nodded, not understanding. They asked each other that night what Christmas meant. Some of the educated ones explained. A holiday, a celebration, something about a birth, about peace, about goodwill to all men. The prisoners did not know what to think. Was this a trick? A test of some kind? Perhaps the Australians were waiting for them to relax, to trust, and then the executions would finally come. That would make sense. That would match what they had been taught. But as the days passed and the invitation was mentioned again, casually, naturally, doubt crept in. What if it was real? What if these farmers actually meant to share food with their prisoners? What if everything the emperor had told them was wrong? And while they wrestled with these questions, the daily discoveries continued to mount. Each morning at the work camps brought fresh evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. Prisoners received bread still warm from baking. Real butter came in small portions, yellow and soft. Jam made from strawberries sat in jars on the table. Tea arrived hot with actual sugar to stir in. The prisoners measured everything in their minds. They had been soldiers. They knew how to calculate rations. This was abundance. This was more than surviving. This was living. Twice a week, beef appeared on their plates. Not scraps or bits of gristle, but actual cuts of meat. 1.2 kilograms per prisoner each week. Back home in Japan, their families were getting 1/10 of that amount if they were lucky. The prisoners knew this from letters that occasionally made it through. Their mothers wrote about hunger. Their wives described children with thin arms and hollow cheeks. Tokyo was running out of everything. Rice was rationed to almost nothing. Vegetables were a memory. And here, in captivity, enemy prisoners ate beef. The farms themselves were like nothing they had seen before. Takeshi Nagase worked on a property that had 15 cattle and more than 200 sheep. The farmer owned a mechanical harvester that rumbled across wheat fields, cutting and bundling grain faster than Nagase could believe. He watched it work one afternoon, his hands idle, his mind racing. a single farm with more machinery than his entire village. Back home, his family had owned 2 acres, maybe 3 in a good year. They shared 1 ox with 3 other families. Every tool was operated by hand, backs bent, hands blistered, dawn to dusk. Every day, just to grow enough rice to survive. Here in Australia, trucks drove right up to the fields, motorized vehicles with engines that never seemed to tire. They hauled tons of grain to storage buildings. Those buildings had refrigeration. Meat hung in cold rooms for weeks without spoiling. Nagas had never seen such technology used for farming. In Japan, this kind of equipment went to the military. Civilians made do with almost nothing. One morning in early December, a Coca-Cola truck arrived at the farm where Hiroshi Abe was working. The driver was making deliveries to properties in the area. The farmer bought 2 cases. He opened bottles for everyone, including the prisoners. The glass was cold. Condensation dripped down the sides. Abe took a sip and felt bubbles explode on his tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. He had tasted sugar maybe twice in the last 2 years. His rations as a soldier had been plain. Rice, sometimes fish if they were near the coast, dried vegetables when supplies allowed. Never anything like this. Never something made just for pleasure, just for taste. The prisoner next to him started to cry, quiet tears running down his face while he drank the Coca-Cola. Nobody said anything. They all understood. This small luxury, this tiny moment of sweetness, showed them how far they were from home, showed them how much their country had lost while telling them they were winning. On Sundays, work ended at noon. The farmer's wife came out to the fields, sometimes with ice cream, vanilla in one container, chocolate in another. She scooped it into small bowls and handed them out. Most of the prisoners had never tasted ice cream before. The cold made their teeth hurt. The cream was rich and thick. Some flavors they could not identify. They ate slowly, trying to memorize the sensation, knowing they might never experience it again. Inside the farmer's kitchen, a radio played music, not propaganda, not speeches about duty and sacrifice and dying for the emperor, just music, songs with guitars and drums, a woman's voice singing about love and dancing. The prisoners could hear it through the open window while they worked in the garden nearby. It was such a strange sound, music for no reason except to enjoy it. In Japan, every broadcast was about the war. Every newspaper, every announcement, everything was about fighting and winning and the sacred duty to destroy the enemy. Here, the radio just played songs. Children appeared sometimes at the farms. The farmers' sons and daughters, ranging from 5 years old to teenagers. They played near where the prisoners worked, kicking balls, chasing chickens, laughing loud and careless. At first, the prisoners had frozen when they saw children approaching. Were they supposed to bow, look away? In Japan, civilians feared soldiers. Children especially knew to be quiet and respectful around military men. But these Australian children ran right up to the fence. They asked questions. What is your name? Where are you from? Do you like it here? Their parents did not stop them, did not warn them to stay back from the dangerous enemy. One little girl, maybe 7 years old, picked flowers and pushed them through the fence wire to Nagase. He took them carefully, his hands shaking slightly. She smiled and ran away. He kept those flowers in his pocket until they crumbled to dust. No one back home would believe this. Enemy children giving flowers to Japanese soldiers. It was impossible. It went against everything. The numbers haunted them at night. Prisoners lying in their bunks doing mathematics in the dark. The average Australian farm they worked on had resources their entire villages lacked. Weekly meat rations here were 1.2 kilograms. Back home, families were getting 0.1 kilograms if they were fortunate. Sugar allocations per prisoner per month were 500 grams. In Japan, sugar had disappeared from stores 2 years ago. Civilians got almost none. The military kept it all, and even soldiers rarely saw it. The guards had started teaching prisoners a few English phrases. Good morning. Thank you. Please pass the water. In return, the prisoners taught Japanese words. The exchanges were careful at first, formal, but slowly something changed. A guard named Thomas learned to say rice and tea in Japanese. He practiced during breaks, getting the pronunciation wrong, laughing at himself. The prisoners corrected him gently. He tried again, got it right. Everyone smiled. It was such a small thing, but it cracked something open. In the barracks, men who had fought across the Pacific shared stories. They had seen friends die in the jungles of New Guinea, not from bullets, but from hunger, eating bark stripped from trees, boiling boot leather to make something, anything, to put in their stomachs. 800 calories a day toward the end. Men became skeletons, skin stretched over bones, eyes sunk deep. And for what? For an empire that told them they were superior while they starved? Nagas wrote in his diary by candlelight. His handwriting was small and careful. These farmers work alongside us, he wrote. They share their food. They let their children near us. They treat us like human beings. Are we the demons, or were we lied to? If we are the superior race, if our empire is destined to rule, then why do these enemies have so much? Why do they waste nothing? Why are their machines so advanced? Why is there ice cream on Sunday and Coca-Cola on Tuesday and meat twice a week? The questions had no answers that made sense anymore. The propaganda had said the Allies were weak, soft, decadent, that their love of comfort would be their downfall. But the prisoners saw efficiency, not weakness. They saw abundance that came from organization, from technology, from systems that worked. Japanese soldiers had been taught that spirit and willingness to die would overcome any material disadvantage. But spirit did not harvest wheat faster than a machine. Willingness to die did not keep meat from spoiling without refrigeration. The first real cracks in their training appeared in quiet moments. A prisoner accepting a cup of tea from a farmer's wife, another laughing at a guard's joke, someone asking how the mechanical harvester worked, genuinely curious, wanting to learn. These tiny moments of normalcy, of human connection, were more dangerous to imperial ideology than any bullet, because they suggested that maybe, just maybe, the enemy was not evil. And if the enemy was not evil, then what did that make the war? What did that make all the death? December 23rd arrived hot and bright. Summer in Australia meant temperatures climbing past 90 degrees by midday. Farmer Jack Thompson walked out to the work detail that afternoon and extended his invitation formally. 6 of you, he said, pointing to the regular workers who had been on his property for months. Christmas Day, come to the house for dinner. 2 o'clock. He said it simply, like he was discussing the weather or the next day's work schedule. Then he walked away, leaving the 6 prisoners standing in stunned silence. That night in the barracks, the debate went for hours. Nagase, Abe, and 4 others sat in a circle on the floor. Their voices stayed low. Other prisoners listened from nearby bunks. Was this honorable? Could they accept food from the enemy and still call themselves soldiers? The imperial code was clear. A warrior maintains dignity even in defeat. But what was dignified about this? Sitting at a family table with people whose countrymen you had tried to kill? Some argued it was a trap. The Australians were finally ready to execute them. They would gather the prisoners in one place, away from witnesses, and end it. That would make sense. That would fit the world they understood. Others were not sure. Months had passed. If the Australians wanted them dead, why wait? Why feed them well and give them medical care first? The logic did not hold. In the end, they decided to accept, partly from curiosity, partly from fear of insulting their captors, partly because something in each of them wanted to see what would happen, wanted to know if this impossible thing could be real. Christmas morning came. The prisoners washed carefully. They had no good clothes, only their work uniforms, but they cleaned them as best they could. They combed their hair, some shaved with borrowed razors. They prepared themselves the way soldiers prepare for battle, with quiet focus and controlled breathing. At 1:30, a guard drove them to Thompson's farmhouse in a truck. Then he left, no escort, no supervision. Just 6 enemy soldiers walking up to a family's front door. Thompson met them outside. No gun, no uniform, just regular clothes, a button shirt and work pants. He smiled and waved them in. The door was open. Inside, the house smelled like cooking meat and something sweet baking. The prisoners removed their shoes without being asked, a habit from home. Thompson's wife, Mary, came out of the kitchen. She wiped flour from her hands and greeted them warmly. "Welcome," she said. "Merry Christmas." The dining table had been extended with extra boards. 9 members of the Thompson family were there. 2 grandparents, Jack and Mary, 3 grown children with their spouses, and 2 grandchildren. They had set places for 6 more. Plates, forks, knives, cups. Everything arranged neatly. The prisoners stood awkwardly until Mary gestured for them to sit. They chose seats carefully, trying not to take the best spots, trying to remain invisible even while being guests. Then the food came out. A roasted lamb, brown and glistening with fat. The smell filled the room, rich and heavy. Potatoes that had been cooked in the meat drippings. Carrots glazed with butter and sugar. Fresh bread, still warm. Gravy in a ceramic boat, thick and dark. Mary and her daughters brought dish after dish until the table was covered. The prisoners stared. This was more food than they had seen in one place since before the war, more than some of them had seen in their entire lives. Jack Thompson stood and said a prayer. The prisoners did not understand all the words, but they recognized the tone. Gratitude, a request for peace, a hope for better days. Then he picked up a knife and began carving the lamb. He served the prisoners first, giving each man a thick slice of meat. He added potatoes and vegetables to their plates until the dishes were piled high. "Eat," he said, "please eat." The prisoners ate slowly at first, carefully. The lamb was tender and rich. Fat melted on their tongues. The potatoes were creamy inside, crispy outside. The carrots were sweet in a way vegetables should not be. They had been cooked with care, with skill, with abundance of ingredients. Gravy soaked into the bread. Butter made everything richer. The prisoners had to stop themselves from eating too fast, from showing how desperately hungry they were for food like this, for kindness like this. Conversation happened around them. The Thompson family talked about normal things, the weather, the crops, plans for the new year. They included the prisoners when they could, asking simple questions. "Do you like the food? Is it too hot today?" The youngest grandchild, a girl about 5 years old, stared openly at Nagase. She had probably never seen a Japanese person before. He smiled at her carefully. She smiled back and offered him a roll from the basket. He took it with a small bow. She giggled. After the main meal, Mary brought out dessert. Plum pudding, dark and dense, topped with custard that poured over it like cream. Fresh fruit in a bowl, apples and pears and something orange the prisoners could not identify. The sweetness was overwhelming. The prisoners ate smaller bites now, their stomachs full but their minds trying to absorb every detail, every flavor, every moment of this impossible meal. It was during dessert that something broke inside Hiroshi Abe. He put down his spoon and his hands began to shake. Tears ran down his face before he could stop them. He tried to hide it, tried to wipe his eyes quickly, but Mary Thompson saw. She did not make a scene. She simply reached across the table and patted his hand. "It is all right," she said quietly. "You are far from home. We understand." That simple touch, that small gesture of comfort, shattered what remained of Abe's training. "We were told you were savages," he said in broken English, the words tumbling out. "We were told Australians would torture us, kill us. But you invite us to your family table. You share food. Your children are here. You are not afraid. I do not understand." Jack Thompson leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, choosing words the prisoners might understand. "You did not choose this war," he said. "We did not choose it either. Our government sent us to fight. But here, at this table, we are just people. It is Christmas. Everyone deserves kindness today." The prisoners wept then, most of them. Not loud crying, but silent tears that they could not control. The Thompson children did not laugh or stare. They had been raised right. They understood that sometimes people cry because they are overwhelmed, because something beautiful has happened in the middle of something terrible. Later, after the meal, the Thompson grandchildren gave the prisoners small gifts, not expensive things, a drawing of the farm, a wooden toy one of the boys had carved, a pressed flower from the garden. The prisoners held these items like they were made of gold. Nagase tucked his pressed flower into his shirt pocket right over his heart. That evening, riding back to the camp in the truck, none of the prisoners spoke. They were processing what had happened. Their entire understanding of the world had been built on lies. The emperor had told them that Japan was superior, that the Allies were demons, that death in battle was the highest honor. But the Thompson family had shown them something different. They had shown that dignity came from how you treated others. That strength was not found in dying, but in living with compassion. That abundance did not come from conquest, but from cooperation and hard work and systems that functioned. Nagase wrote in his diary that night by candlelight. "Our emperor told us death was glory," he wrote. "These farmers show us life is the glory. They have everything we were told we were fighting for. Plenty, peace, strong families. And they achieved it without war, without empire, without sacrifice of millions." The realization was painful. Everything they had been taught was backwards. The propaganda had inverted reality. Japan did not need to conquer to be great. It needed to build, to organize, to treat people with respect. The prisoners had seen it with their own eyes. One Australian farm was more efficient than entire Japanese villages. Not because Australians were superior, but because they had machines, systems, education, freedom to innovate. The Christmas dinner had done something no battle could do. It had opened their eyes to the truth. And that truth was going to be very dangerous to carry home. September 1945. The war ended with 2 atomic bombs and an emperor's radio announcement: surrender. The word tasted like poison in every Japanese mouth. For the first time in history, Japan had been defeated. The prisoners in Australia heard the news in their barracks. Some wept, some sat in silence. A few felt something they could not name, something that might have been relief. Repatriation began slowly. Ships had to be found. Routes had to be planned. 14,000 Japanese prisoners prepared to leave Australia. They packed their few belongings. They said goodbye to guards who had become something close to friends. The death rate in Fannin Sin's Australian camps had been 0.5%, 0.5%. The prisoners knew what that meant. They had heard stories from other camps. 27% of Allied prisoners died in Japanese custody. The math was clear. The contrast was undeniable. Takeshi Nagase packed carefully. He had very little: a spare shirt, a pair of work pants, his diary wrapped in cloth to protect it, and 3 items he treasured more than anything. A pressed flower from Mary Thompson's garden, carefully preserved between pages of thin paper. A photograph taken on Christmas Day, showing him standing with the Thompson family, everyone smiling. A hand-drawn map of the farm, sketched from memory, every building and fence line marked. The ship journey home took 3 weeks. Nagase stood at the rail often, watching the ocean. He thought about what waited for him. His family had lived in a suburb of Hiroshima. He had received no letters in months. The last news he heard was that the city had been destroyed by a special bomb. He tried to imagine what that meant, tried to prepare himself, but nothing could prepare him for what he saw when the ship docked. Japan was ruins. Yokohama port had been bombed so many times that only broken concrete remained where buildings once stood. The prisoners walked down the gangway onto land that felt foreign. This was home, but it looked like the surface of the moon, gray, dead, empty. Nagase took a train toward Hiroshima, or what used to be Hiroshima. The tracks had been repaired, but everything else was gone. 40% of urban Japan had been destroyed. The windows on the train showed mile after mile of rubble, burned foundations, twisted metal, occasional walls standing alone with nothing attached. People walked through the destruction like ghosts, thin, hollow-eyed, moving slowly to conserve energy. When Nagase reached his neighborhood, he could not find his house. The entire area had been flattened. He walked in circles, trying to orient himself by street corners that no longer existed. Finally, he found the spot where his family home had stood. Nothing remained but ash and broken tiles. He knelt down and sifted through the debris with his hands, looking for anything, any sign of his family. A neighbor recognized him, an old woman who had somehow survived. She told him his mother and sister had died in the initial blast. His father had died 2 weeks later from radiation sickness, though she did not use those words. She just said he got sick and could not recover. Nagase thanked her. His voice sounded far away. He pulled the pressed flower from his pocket and looked at it. This fragile thing from Australia, this proof that beauty and kindness still existed somewhere in the world. Food was scarce in a way that made Australian prison camps look like paradise. Ration cards allowed 1,050 calories per day. That was the official amount. In reality, people got less, much less. Supply lines were broken. Farms had been abandoned. Young men who knew how to work the land had died in the war. Nagase watched children beg in the streets. Their arms were thin as sticks. Their bellies were swollen from malnutrition. Old people lay in doorways, too weak to move. He had eaten better as a prisoner than these people ate as civilians in their own country. The mechanical contrast hurt worst of all. Nagase found work eventually. helping to rebuild in a rural area outside the city. They had no machines, no trucks, no tractors or harvesters. Everything was done by hand, men with shovels, women carrying buckets, the same tools their grandparents had used 100 years ago. He thought about the Thompson farm, that single mechanical harvester, one machine doing the work of 40 people. Australia had such things on ordinary farms. Japan had nothing. He was forbidden to speak about his time in captivity. The government made that clear. Returned prisoners who talked about comfortable treatment were seen as traitors, as men who had dishonored the war, dead by surviving well. Nagase kept quiet in public, but he found other returned prisoners sometimes. They met in secret, in quiet corners of tea houses or parks. They shared their forbidden memories in whispers, the food, the kindness, the realization that everything they had been told was a lie. Nagase kept his diary hidden for 30 years. He buried it under floorboards. He told no one, not even his wife when he eventually married. But he thought about it constantly. The Christmas dinner, the Thompson children, the simple decency of people who had every reason to hate him but chose kindness instead. In 1952, 7 years after the war ended, Nagase did something dangerous. He wrote a letter to the Thompson family. He did not know if they would receive it, did not know if they would remember him, did not know if mail between former enemies was even allowed. But he wrote anyway. He thanked them. He told them their kindness had changed his life. He explained that he had lost his family, but their memory kept him going. 6 months later, a reply came. Jack Thompson had written back. The old farmer's handwriting was shaky but readable. He said, of course they remembered. How could they forget? He asked about Nagase's life, invited him to visit if he ever had the chance, suggested they were friends, not enemies. That war had tried to make them hate each other, but had failed. The correspondence continued for years, letters crossing the ocean slowly, Nagase sharing small details about rebuilding Japan, Thompson describing changes on the farm. They never discussed politics, never debated who was right or wrong. Just two men who had shared a meal once, staying connected across impossible distance. In 1978, Nagase finally saved enough money to return to Australia. He brought his adult son with him. He wanted the boy to see, to understand. They flew to Sydney and then took a smaller plane to the rural area where the Thompson farm still operated. Jack Thompson was elderly now, in his 80s, but he stood at the same door where he had welcomed prisoners 34 years earlier. The two old men embraced. Both were crying. Nagase had brought gifts from Japan, hand-painted silk, his family's sake cup, one of the few items that had survived the bombing. A formal letter of apology, written in careful characters, asking forgiveness for the war. Thompson read the letter through reading glasses. Then he folded it carefully and handed it back. "You were never our enemy," he said. "War was our enemy. You were just a young man far from home, same as my boys who went to fight, same as everyone." They spent 3 days at the farm. Nagase's son took photographs. The old men walked the fields together, moving slowly, stopping often to rest. Thompson showed him the mechanical harvester, newer now, but the same principle. Nagase explained how he had tried to introduce similar ideas in Japan, how hard it had been, how slowly things changed. On the last evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, the same porch where Nagase had sat in 1944, scared and confused, and far from everything he knew. Thompson asked him what he remembered most about that Christmas. Nagase thought for a long time before answering. "Your wife's hand on mine," he finally said, when I was crying. She touched my hand like I was a person, not a prisoner, not an enemy, a person who was sad and far from home. That moment taught me more than all my military training. It taught me that humanity is stronger than nationalism, that kindness is braver than conquest. Nagase raised his children with those lessons. He told them to question authority, to reject propaganda, to choose compassion over duty when the two conflicted. His grandson became a peace activist in the 1990s, citing his grandfather's experience. Several other former prisoners published memoirs in their old age, finally able to speak the truth they had hidden for decades. The stories were all similar. They had expected death and received life. They had been taught their enemies were demons and found them to be human. They had believed their empire was superior and discovered it was built on lies and hunger and suffering. Nagase died in 1998. He was 91 years old. Among his possessions, his family found the diary, the pressed flour, now brown and brittle but still preserved, the photograph from Christmas 1944, faded but clear, and a handwritten note dated just weeks before his death. In that Australian farmhouse on Christmas 1944, I learned what my military training tried to destroy. That humanity transcends nationality. That abundance comes from cooperation, not conquest. And that a simple meal shared with enemies can shatter the lies of empires. The war taught me to die. That Christmas dinner taught me to live.